Thanks for joining me for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Back in June, the federal Liberal government published regulations to prohibit the manufacture, import, and sale of 6 categories of single-use plastics by the end of this year. Let's delve into the impacts of this policy with our two special guests. First, Peter Shawn Taylor returns. He's the senior features editor of C2C Journal. And Tony Elenis is also here. He's a first-time guest. He's the president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel, and Motel Association. Welcome to both of you.
Glad to be here.
Glad to be on your show.
Peter, let's start with you. You have
Sure.
written an interesting article that the plastic ban will make basically a lot of things that we consider working basically not really working as well. So maybe if you can elaborate on that, that could be the start of this episode.
Sure. It's when I started to look into this topic, especially going through the government's own reports and documents and assessments and cost benefit analysis. What I discovered is that for a very small benefit in supposed reduction in garbage or ocean waste, the results of banning these 6 single-use plastic items is going to be a whole raft of things. It's going to make almost everything else much worse. It's going to increase inflation. It's going to increase garbage, surprisingly enough. It's going to increase greenhouse gas emissions, which is doubly surprising from coming from this federal Liberal government. It's going to send jobs overseas. It's going to make it harder to drink your margarita. So this the scale of negative effects arising from this ban is really quite surprising, and set aside the benefits, they're really small. It's a strange policy that seems to be based on a kind of almost a religious belief that plastic is bad or evil in some way and we have to get rid of it. It's not really grounded in reality at all.
And we're going to dive into various aspects of that as the show progresses, but I do want to give Tony a chance as well. Tell me a little bit about the association and what your members are saying about this issue.
Thank you, Tony. And this legislation coming up, it is a rule that the industry would embrace only if we had more of a phasing approach, more time to look at alternatives, and with government's help, to look at ways and means of, for example, there's these non-conventional plastics that are out there made of by plant products. And we hear from experts that municipalities don't have the infrastructure to efficiently recycle this product and put it into land use. That needs to be looked at more. The plastic items that we are using, all those 6 categories affect our industry, and across Canada, all businesses that use them by about $2 billion in the next 10 years. In an industry that just came out of COVID and is hurting more now in recovery because of inflation, because of the workforce issues. So it's not about not embracing environmental issues that all governments everywhere are talking about. It's about doing it the right way and having more time for industry to recover out of unprecedented critical pandemic that came upon us.
Yeah, Tony, just sticking with you for a second, is it mostly the plastic straws and plastic cutlery? Is that the big issue for your group?
All plastics are utilized in our industry, and especially in the takeout and delivery approach that we have, which is really the category that has dramatically grown in our industry since COVID came upon, and there's more growth ahead. So we use those products, all 6 categories, very often, every day, and there's no alternative product to replace it. So if we go into replacing something that's been traditionally there and not stable in the way we operate, there has to be a replacement that is safe, and a replacement that is economically feasible to use. And we don't see those two dilemmas answered yet.
We're going to return to our conversation with our guests shortly. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Peter Shawn Taylor. He's the one of the editors of C2C Journal. And Tony Elenis is also joining us. He's the president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel, and Motel Association, talking about the plastics ban. Peter, getting back to you, you alluded to this a little bit, and I think you mentioned this in your article. What is so good about plastics? What good have they done in our society?
Well, I think since the Second World War, all of society has benefited tremendously from what has been really a plastics revolution in terms of you can't you go around your house or your car anywhere. Plastic has made an enormous difference in plumbing and medical devices and food storage and all sorts of building electrical equipment. And now we have the 3D printing, which promises even more plastic revolutions in the future if you want. I mean, plastic is a really really useful thing because it's lightweight, it's inexpensive to make. It has all sorts of properties of flexibility and sterility, and you can go on and on. Everybody knows why plastic is useful, and keep in mind, people of a certain age might remember when you used to get your groceries in paper bags, and how much of an improvement it was when the stores switched to plastic bags, because now if you had a leaking meat container or something got soggy, the bottom didn't fall out. They had handles so you could carry them. We seem to have forgotten the fact that plastic has improved. Plastic straws are better than paper straws, and now we're going back to paper straws. So it seems to be quite regressive in many ways, because people seem to have forgotten what the benefits of plastic are, because we live with them so much that they're just become part of the background, I guess.
So there is this element of discourse about a plastic pollution crisis. Should we be concerned about that, or is there a lot of waste going on? What are your thoughts on that, Peter?
But no, as part of this build up to this plastics ban, the government commissioned a report by Deloitte on sort of all aspects of the plastics industry. And what they found is that 99% of all plastic that's produced is properly disposed of in some way. It's either landfilled, it's recycled, it's burned for energy, etc. Only 1%, so that's 29,000 tons of plastic a year, disappear somehow, and presumably become garbage or litter. Yeah, I'm not saying that 29,000 tons isn't a lot, and you could maybe reduce it even better, and reduce it to a lower number, and that would be better. But it's certainly not a crisis. And a lot of the activists, Greenpeace, et cetera, will talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. In fact, that's produced by the Asian fishing industry almost exclusively. Canada has nothing to do with that. It's the figures are minuscule, not even measurable for the amount of plastic waste that Canada contributes to the garbage patch. So, or ocean waste in general. So it's really a misapprehension of the problem. We don't really have a plastic waste problem that requires some kind of dramatic ban that we've been given.
Tony, it seems to me that your members are being pulled in a lot of different directions. People want the hotels and motels and restaurants reopened after COVID, and they are they're used to a certain amount of cleanliness, and single use comes into play there. And yet now there's this demand for that these plastics not be available. So is that what you're hearing from your members as well?
Well, Tony, hospitality and perhaps the grocery stores are the two biggest gatekeepers to the consumers. And all this talk about climate change is affecting the new consumers' thinking and use of all types of materials, including eating habits. So we're affected specifically from what the consumer wants to do and the consumer seems to be listening to the environmental agenda more so. Many in our industry have already moved and embraced environmental practices without any rules, without any regulations. But the vast majority out there are made of small business, independent operators that don't have the resources, don't have the leverage to bring prices down. And importantly, most don't even know this will happen
Hmm.
because their focus right now is to keep the doors open.
Yeah,
So
no, yeah, no, you've raised a good point. We're going to take a brief commercial break. Tony, we'll get back to you right after that break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Peter Shawn Taylor of C2C Journal and the president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association, Tony Elenis. Tony, I had to cut you off there, but you're making a point about how your members really want to be part of the solution, and they have been moving to other products. How's that going?
many have even before the pandemic, when the word in the street was that black straws are not efficient and do not do the job to the environmental reasons. And many what we might call leaders in the industry have moved forward, but there are only a few of how many businesses operate in the food service and the hotel sector. We are there to embrace and support environmental practices. Why not? But this has moved too fast. There are a lot of risks here because Canada is the first jurisdiction among other peers that is doing it. And being the first in this type of a massive change will hurt many businesses in this case and consumers because they'll pay more. Some analysis I was doing, some research I was doing some time ago, is going to cost about $5 more for every consumer with this change in a time that inflation is at its worst we've seen in many years.
Yeah, Peter, I want to turn to that point that Tony's just made.
Mhm.
And I think you made a similar point about the false economy of this. You know, uh, you're going from a cheap product that can be made relatively efficiently to other products that are trying to replace it that might have more of an impact on the environment. Can you elaborate on that, Peter?
Sure. Well, beside Tony's point that they're more expensive, when you replace plastic cutlery with a wooden knife or a plastic bag with a paper bag and plastic takeout trays with some sort of fiber. They're not only more expensive, but according to the government's own research, they have a more significant environmental impact because you're talking about generally making paper, cutting down trees. There's all sorts of water effects on those. There's a big issue is the fact that replacements are much heavier. A paper bag weighs almost 7 times more than a plastic bag. So those have to be shipped around. I was talking to one plastic bag manufacturer in my story, and he says, he can get 2.3 million plastic bags on one transport truck, 7 or 8 transport trucks to move the same number of paper bags. So that's another environmental impact that gets overlooked. And as I said, you go through the federal government's own analysis, and they admit that making the replacement products is going to be worse for the environment than making the plastic products, what's called the upstream implications. And then if I could just jump to the downstream, again, the government's own analysis admits that garbage is going to go up because of this, because plastic bags and stuff, they're really light, and garbage expenses are proportionate to weight. So they're saying we're going to save about 1.6 million tons of plastic garbage, but we're going to create 3.2 million more tons of paper garbage. So again, the government's own results show that they're going to double the amount of garbage as compared to what they're saving. So it doesn't make any sense at all. It's a profoundly anti-environmental policy for this tiny benefit about a little less plastic garbage. in the oceans.
Peter, we've got about a minute before the break,
Mhm.
but is this really a proxy fight against oil and gas? Is this what this is all about?
I think at the core, no one is going to come out and say it, but plastic is sort of fossil fuels made solid, right? The plastic resin industry comes from the petroleum industry, and yeah, you talk to Greenpeace and they talk about big oil and big plastic. It does have this kind of almost religious fervor, as I mentioned earlier. It does seem that there's this animosity that defies logic, that is perhaps tied to the fact that as you said, plastics come from oil and gas, and we know oil and gas is bad, so plastics must be bad too.
Indeed, and it seems to be on very different fronts, including the fact that, and you've made this point as well, that we are seeking in Canada to ban all plastic production by 2030. Maybe we'll jump on that point after the break, because that will have serious impacts on, as you said, medical devices and other things that we kind of count on to be in our lives.
Mhm.
So we will return after the break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Peter Shawn Taylor of C2C Journal and Tony Elenis. He is president of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association, talking about the plastic ban. And Peter was kind enough during the break to correct me. They're not banning all plastic production, but we are going to zero plastic waste. So maybe describe that a little bit and maybe its impacts, Peter.
Well, I'd love to describe it, but no one really knows what it means. Zero plastic waste. Presumably, it means we recycle everything. Um, what happens when to your heart valve when you don't need it anymore, or the plastic parts on your car? I don't know. What seems more likely is that they're going to move sort of the federal Liberals will sort of gradually ban more and more things, or bring in more and more restrictive rules. Packaging is probably going to be the next shoe to drop. The way they've set up through the Environmental Protection Act, they can add anything they want to this list of six. The list of six banned items is certainly not exhaustive. They can add new things to it as they see fit by ministerial fiat. So we don't really know. What we do know is that the federal Liberals don't like plastic. We don't know how this will manifest itself by 2030 when they move to net zero. But based on the first blow struck, it's probably going to make things worse rather than better.
Tony, coming back to you, from what you've been saying on this program, really, this is all about a lot of your members facing a lot of uncertainty, particularly during COVID and then post-COVID. And this is kind of like another piece of icing on the cake. So maybe just to describe in your own words the uncertainty that your members have faced, and why you're looking for better times, not harder times.
Well, the restaurants have opened, once COVID was behind us, and we all should be excited and very glad for that. But the problems have not. They actually have become more critical. There are many customers in a typical restaurant. The revenue is there, but not much of it flows to the bottom line. And for many, it's not talking about profit, it's about keeping the doors open. Food pricing. Food pricing has gone up tremendously, close to 10%, depending what menu various concepts have. And 40% of all their expenses is buying food. They're paying a lot more for employees. Workforce issue is detrimental to their success. We have restaurants that have sections closed and limit the hours of operation. Never heard of. And this industry was operating at 3.2 pre-tax profit margin before 2020 came upon it. We are now in a desperate situation. The federal government loans, the CEBA loan, is coming up for payments. That's another pressure on a typical restaurant. And of course, we've always had the issue of price elasticity, where prices go up in a restaurant, and many consumers don't want to go back and don't want to go back that often, because they always can go to the grocery store, our biggest competitor, and buy food much more cheaper And even though those prices have gone up, but it's not the same comparison in their minds as going to a restaurant and seeing a 10% increase. So yes, we are more desperate right now than we were during COVID.
Uh, Thank you for that. Peter, we've got just less than a minute left. Maybe this
Mhm.
is an unfair question to do in a minute, but maybe if you can encapsulate what is science saying about plastics and the alternatives?
Well, quickly, there's been quite a few sort of life cycle studies, and that they'll admit that if plastic bag versus paper bag is sort of the iconic battle. Plastic bags do create a little bit of litter. Everybody admits that, but the impacts of switching from plastic to paper are much more detrimental to the environment, and there's ample evidence on this. So if you're replacing plastic bags with paper bags, you're probably going to make things worse, and I think that probably holds for the rest of the plastics industry as well. But there's lots of evidence on that, and I'd leave it at that.
Gentlemen, it's been a really interesting discussion. I want to thank both of you for being on the program, and certainly I wish you all the best in your advocacy.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be
Thank you
here.
for having us.
Thanks again to Tony Elenis and Peter Shawn Taylor for being on the program today, talking about the plastics ban, the first part of which comes into effect at the end of this year. Obviously, some big impacts for consumers as well as for those who are giving you services. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.